first, Professor Peter Piot once described himself as an outbreak detective. He helped identify the deadly Ebola virus, which was killing people in Central Africa. And as the founder of UNAIDS, he for many years led the global fight against HIV/AIDS. He's just written a book about his incredible career and came into the Outlook studio to tell me how it all began.
I grew up in a small village in Flanders, in the woods actually. My father was a civil servant and an economist by training and into foreign trade, promoting also Belgian agriculture, and came from a family of farmers, also quite heavy drinkers and people who enjoy life. And my mother went to school until she was 15, was interrupted by the war, by World War II, and had to help with her father in a construction company, and after a few years ended up managing about 100 masons, and so not an intellectual but someone who really is a problem solver.
So where did your interest in medicine come from?
Well, I was interested in a few things. My number one goal in life was get out of here, at my village, and see the world. I was fascinated by the world and adventure and so on. And secondly, there wasn't much going on in that area, but there was a small museum of where the local saint was born, Father Damien, who spent his life treating leprosy patients, particularly in Hawaii, and died from leprosy. And so I went off and I cycled to this museum, and was fascinated by the pictures of disfigured leprosy patients. And I was interested also in science. Always. So for me, medicine was kind of a combination of my thirst for science knowledge, but also for helping people and to have a passport for the world.
When you were a medical student, you were told there's no point specialising in infectious diseases. We've got them under control. We've got vaccines and we've got antibiotics. Why did you ignore that advice?
Well, I guess can be a bit stubborn to start with, but also I thought they were wrong, because they were only looking at my professors then at health in Belgium, in Western Europe, but I was interested in developing countries. I was looking at Africa, and I saw that infectious diseases were and still are the number one killers. And also I had learned that there was not much research going on, and so I said, I want to go for it. And so I was interested both in microbes and in people and in the interaction. So again, a combination of my absolute high degree of curiosity, scientific curiosity, the microbes, but also doing something against diseases of people.
And you were proved right.
I ended medical school, and I went into infectious diseases and training in microbiology, and I eventually did a PhD in that, a doctorate. And 2 years later, when I was still in training, here came the absolute evidence that I was right, or that my professors were wrong, and we isolated this new virus.
Tell us how that came about, first off. I mean, how did this new virus enter your life?
Things happen, in life, in the sense that I was doing normal work in the lab, learning how to isolate viruses with a few young colleagues, and here we get a thermos flask, one of those shiny Chinese quasi-fluorescent type of thermos flasks, and there were some samples in there of with blood from a Flemish nun who had died with a mysterious disease. They thought maybe yellow fever, in the middle of what was then called Zaire.
Now Congo.
And now Congo. And one of the vials was actually broken, and so there was blood swimming in among the in the water and what was left of ice cubes. And somebody had just transported it in hand luggage from the commercial flight from Kinshasa. Today that would be absolutely against the law, but in these days there was kind of quite a way that we would transport viruses. And we did all the kind of routine procedures, not knowing, of course, that there is a new virus in there. You don't know that when you are doing this kind of work. But then when, under the electron microscope, we saw that this virus looked like a gigantic worm, gigantic by viral standards. You can't see it even with a normal microscope. We said, oh, God, this is, what is this? And this was before Google, so we had to go to the library and find an atlas of viruses with with images of viruses, and then we saw, oh, this looks like Marburg virus, a virus that was just discovered a few years ago and had killed in the city of Marburg in Germany, had killed a number of people who were working in a vaccine plant, and they were infected by manipulating cells from kidneys of African green monkeys, which I used to develop to grow polio vaccine. So that's how Ebola and I would say global health entered into my life. And 2 weeks later, or less than that, I was on the equator in what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness. But I think it was a lot of light there.
So within 2 weeks, you've gone from looking at this new virus under a microscope to realising something is happening here. What is going through your mind at
A million
point?
things. I mean, it's one, I'd never been to Central Africa, to Sub-Saharan Africa, and then certainly not in the equatorial forest, because the epidemic was really going on in an area near the Congo River, near a town called Bumba, where the river is over 20 kilometers wide. And so it's the vegetation, it's the earth is red. People were living in very small villages in the forest. The roads were just basically no roads. So that was one part of the story. And then there was this incredibly exciting adventure of trying to figure out how is this virus transmitted. We had no clue.
So what did you do there to try to find the source of this virus and how it was transmitted?
Well, our priority was to stop the epidemic, I must say. But in order to do that, you need to have an idea how the virus is spread. And very early on, we talked to people. We went around the villages. We talked to the nuns who were still there. 4 had died. The surviving nuns and then survivors in villages, we asked them questions. What happened to the people? And then it turned out that there were 2 elements that were very important facts. One, most people who had died with Ebola virus had been at the hospital. And 2, others had attended funerals of people who had come down with Ebola virus. What we did was try to figure out something and answer 3 very simple questions. And we call them time, place, and person. In other words, we try to figure out, is the number of cases still increasing or is it decreasing? Where are we in time? Place, where are these people from? You map it out. And then person, who are the people? So, and the 2 very simple questions, age and sex. You break it down by age and sex. And then it turned out that we found far more women between 20 and 30 than men of that age. And then it turned out that these women had come to the antenatal clinic at the hospital and all got injections. And we found then that there were only 3 syringes. And so the story for me was not only a scientifically important discovery, but also that doing good is not enough. You also need to know what you're doing. And competency is important.
You're a young man at this point,
yes.
in a country that you're not familiar with, looking into a virus that nobody understands at this point. How were you affected by that experience?
I was 27, so and the first thing was for me was the exciting. Everything is new, and I loved it, and I thought this was. I realized that this would not happen again in my life. But it was also, I would say, a discovery not only of a virus but also of myself, in the sense that I grew up in an environment and a culture. The Flemish culture is really, you work hard, you don't ask questions, and here I found myself in charge of operations, doing things that I only thought that happened in books. And so it gave me a lot of confidence, but also I had found a mission in my life, and that is to work on health in developing countries.
How did you come a few years later to get involved in research into HIV/AIDS?
I was then in Antwerp after I came back from the US, where I went for some further training, and then we started seeing patients, men and women, from Central Africa, Europeans and Africans, with a mysterious disease. They all died. They had very unusual infections. And in 1981, we read about this new disease that was affecting gay men, homosexual men in the United States, and later on also in Western Europe. And it didn't even have a name yet. What we know today is called AIDS. And our patients, they looked very similar what they had in terms of infections. But, you know, we had quite a lot of women, about 30–40%. So that was unusual. And secondly, we talked to the men, and all denied that they had sex with another man. And, okay, some may have lied, but not everybody. And I was also thinking, why would a virus care about the sexual orientation of its host? Because all your existence as a virus, your purpose is to perpetuate your life, you know, and that's how you do it. So I didn't accept that it could be only so-called gay disease. And secondly, I thought, if we see 100 patients here in Belgium, because we had about 100 in Antwerp and Brussels, there must be thousands in their country of origin, because who can afford to come to Europe for medical care? So I found a bit of money, and with some American friends, and one of whom I knew from the Ebola outbreak, and some Congolese colleagues in 1983, we really, some people would say discover, but I don't think it's discovered. It's like America was never discovered. It was there, no? So we unveiled that there was a big heterosexual epidemic.
What personal risks have you taken to try to get at the cause of this, to try to understand it, not only HIV/AIDS, but also Ebola, in the course of your career?
During the Ebola outbreak, I think once I fell ill with diarrhea and headache and fever, and that's how Ebola starts. And so I said, oh my God, I got it as well, and I'll be dead in a week. Fortunately, 24 hours, I didn't have it. But instead of reporting that I had developed fever and so on, which normally would have put me in quarantine, I kept my mouth shut and hoped that it would get better. So that was maybe not so responsible. In terms of AIDS, one day I did something extremely stupid, and I always told students not to do it. I recapped a needle. So after having drawn blood from a patient with AIDS, I put the needle back in the cap, and I, of course, had a needle stick in my finger. That really frightened me also, because there was no way these days. There was in '83, there was no test. Like today, there was no HIV test. That gave me a few sleepless nights. But then later on, a few months later, I was tested, and fortunately it turned out to be negative. But I think the risk is more that it was the sense of urgency. As the title of my book, No Time to Lose, is always kind of forgetting that there's also maybe also neglected a bit my family and so on, you know. So that's also a risk, I would say, for others then.
What kind of sacrifices were you making of your personal life?
Well, I was never home, basically. I was always on the road trying to set up projects, mobilize the money. Then later, when I was head of UNAIDS, convincing political leaders particularly to take AIDS seriously, to put it on the world's agenda, to negotiate a lower price for drugs, for treatment. All that is extremely time intensive and labor intensive. Yeah, my children didn't see their father too often, nor did my wife, yes.
And you were divorced, I think, from your first wife?
Yes, yes. So that's, I regret that was a price that they had to pay. And yeah.
But you can look back over a career with some tremendous achievements in it that has made a significant difference to a lot of people. And when you look back, what is the point that you feel made it for you?
I think that I, plus many others, succeeded in putting AIDS and I would say also global health on the top of the world's agenda. The G8 we're talking about it, the UN General Assembly, the African Union. And secondly, I think that thanks to our work, there are now 7 million people on antiretroviral therapy in the developing world, most of them in Africa. Basically all of them would have died and would be dead by now. So I think that's some achievements, but I also know very well it's not a success, because there are still close to 2 million people who die every year from AIDS. It's the first cause of death in Africa. There's still more than 2 million people who become infected. So I don't have the sense of that the job is done, you know, it's not over.
You've had this tremendously eventful and successful life. And you've talked about the passions that motivated you, but what is it? What characteristic in you has driven you all these years?
I think it's a mixture of a high degree of curiosity. Always, as a child, I drove my parents nuts by always asking why. This is the kind of child I was. But so curiosity, wanting to know what's going on in the world, but also I have a low degree of tolerance for what I see as injustice. I don't know why, but and that is also another driver.
Professor Peter Piot. His book is called No Time to Lose, A Life in Pursuit of Deadly Viruses. This is Outlook from the BBC World Service. I'm Jo Fidgen. Coming later in the programme, how children in